Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Tuesday, the 22nd of August. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 545 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will take a look at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. Nearly 90 plane flights in and out of Moscow were disrupted after Russia said it jammed a Ukrainian drone in the Russky district west of the capital and destroyed another one in the Istrinsky district nearby. The local governor said at least 2 people were injured when parts of a Ukrainian drone fell on a house in the Moscow region. The Russian mercenary leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has published his first recruitment video for the Wagner Group since organising a short-lived mutiny against defence officials in Russia. In a video posted on Telegram, it shows a person who appears to be the mercenary leader saying that the Wagner Group is hiring real strongmen and making Russia even greater on all continents and Africa even more free. The video is thought to have been filmed in Africa. The Greek Prime Minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, has said Russian war crimes that have taken place in Ukraine must be punished under international law. During a press conference with Volodymyr Zelensky yesterday, Mitsotakis added that he unreservedly condemned Russia's aggression in Ukraine. It has also been announced that Greece will take part in the training of Ukrainian Air Force pilots for F-16 jets, following Denmark and the Netherlands confirming that they would supply the first F-16s to Ukraine. In Copenhagen yesterday, President Zelensky thanked Danish politicians for helping his country resist Russia's invasion. Ukraine's president said that if Russia succeeded, other parts of Europe would be at risk from the Kremlin's military aggression. Denmark's decision to supply Ukraine with American F-16 fighter jets to fend off Russia's invasion represents an escalation of the conflict, Russia's ambassador to Denmark, Vladimir Barbin, is reported to have said. And the Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister, Hanna Maliar, has said that Ukraine's forces are repelling Russian attacks and have retaken several square kilometers on the eastern front over the past week. She said that Ukrainian forces were advancing south of Bakhmut, the city occupied by Russian forces in May after a bloody months-long struggle, and they had liberated another 3 square kilometers over the past week. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined this evening by Maureen Watt, who's a retired politician and former Minister for Mental Health in the Scottish Government. Maureen was a regional MSP for North East Scotland from 2006 until 2011 and was then the member of our Scottish Parliament representing the constituency of Aberdeen South and North Kincardine from 2011 until 2021 when she was lucky enough to retire. Maureen has also been a teacher and a counsellor amongst many other roles. Maureen, good evening. How are you keeping?
Yeah, good evening, Andrew, and thank you very much for having me on your programme again. It's a pleasure.
Well, it's our pleasure to see you on Broadcasting Scotland again this evening, Maureen. Thank you for joining us. Our first item this evening is that the Drugs and Alcohol Policy Minister, Elena Whitham, has welcomed a record fall in the number of drug-related deaths and has reaffirmed her commitment to continue the national mission to reduce deaths and improve lives impacted by drugs. The figures, published by National Records of Scotland, found that 1,051 people died due to drug misuse in 2022, a decrease of 279 deaths, 21%, compared with 2021, and it's also the lowest annual total since 2017. Ms. Whitham visited Back on the Road, the employability project, today. Back on the Road is based in Bridgeton Bus Garage in Glasgow's East End and is one of hundreds of grassroots projects across Scotland helping save and improve lives. Its delivery of training in the restoration of vintage vehicles has now returned to pre-pandemic operating levels thanks to £244,000 of funding over 5 years from the Scottish Government's Local Support Fund administered by the Cora Foundation. The Drugs and Alcohol Policy Minister Elena Whitham said, "My sympathy goes out to all those affected by the loss of a loved one through drugs. While I am pleased to see that hundreds of families have been spared this agony and lives have been saved, every life lost is a tragedy, and the number of deaths is still too high. She went on, I will never underestimate the scale of the challenge we continue to face, including responding to new threats such as synthetic opioids and stimulant use. I can see that our work across Scotland, where we are already supporting 300 grassroots projects, including Back to the Road, is gathering pace, and I'm grateful to all those delivering vital services. As part of our £250 million national mission on drugs, we'll continue to focus on getting more people into the form of treatment and support that they need, expand access to residential rehabilitation, and drive the rollout of life-saving medication-assisted treatment standards where we are making significant progress. As we highlighted in our recent drug law reform proposals, the UK government could do more to work with us to help introduce harm reduction measures. And of course, Peter Crikant, who campaigns on social justice and harm reduction, tweeted today, every death is someone's someone. The reduction is welcome, but more needs done now. OPCs, DAT and drug checking with more dangerous drugs appearing across the UK. So Maureen, could this admittedly extremely welcome reduction, could it be taken perhaps as a sign that we now have begun to get a grip on the problem, but that these figures are a starting point, not the end?
Well, absolutely. It's the starting point and not the end. I hope that it is the beginning of the much needed downward trend, but we are still seeing about 3 deaths a day that are drug related, and those are 3 families and friends and loved ones who are grieving that loss. But as you pointed out, there are over 300 grassroots projects now there offering help to people with drug related problems. And I think it's really important to get across the message that there is help in your community if you seek it. And it's a two-way process. Obviously, those involved in drug related projects have to try and engage with the people who are needing help, but also that the families and the people themselves need to want the help. That's really important. So it's important for the projects that the Scottish Government and local authorities are funding to be available with the right treatment, personalised for the person, and more particularly at the right time. So there's not one single fix to this problem. I'm glad that the drugs related deaths have fallen and fallen quite substantially, but there's still, as you say, Andrew, very much more to do. But as I say, we need to get the message across that the help is out there, and whether it's diversionary activities away from drugs like the project visited by the Minister today, it is important, as I say, to get the message out there that there is help available.
Thanks, Maureen. As you say, there's clearly not one single solution to this challenge across our society, and also that messaging is important. Cranston, one of the NGOs that operates in this sector, also said today that whilst it is encouraging to see figures fall, these numbers are about 18 months old and do not account for the emergence of synthetic opioids contaminating the drug supply. They went on, urgent action including the implementation of integrated diamorphine treatment, the expansion, training and awareness of naloxone, and the implementation of overdose prevention centres must be at the heart of the response. Now, it struck me, as you say, there's a number of aspects to the response in there, but also the language struck me as interesting. Cranston were referring there to overdose prevention centres, whereas we know that whilst this has been a matter of public debate and discourse, they're usually referred to in the rest of the media as drug consumption rooms. So do you think that that language in the messaging here, and also, of course, as a matter of policy, we are trying to move away from referring to people who are struggling with illness related to drugs as junkies? We refer to them as other human beings or patients. So do you think that language is, that language is starting to cut through here, and that the debate and the discussion is starting to be framed in a more constructive and inclusive manner, especially as it seems that the work that's being done now is beginning to have bear fruit.
Well, I think the language is changing in some sectors, but not all. I mean, we have seen the London-based Tory party today saying they still treat it as a criminal matter, a justice matter, not a health matter, and drug consumption is an illness, not a criminal matter initially. And we have got to look at it from that perspective. And you're right, Andrew, we have got to be using all the tools in the toolbox. And at the moment, a number of the tools we are prevented from using in Scotland because some of the drug related laws are still retained at Westminster, including, as you say, the overdose treatment centres. Now, I cannot for the life of me see why anyone would not want to have overdose treatment centres as one of the tools in the toolbox for stopping drugs death. We know that naloxone works in virtually every single occasion, and it is important that more and more people are trained to use naloxone. But that in itself is not going to work. If people are going to continue to take drugs, then we have got to have a space where they can come and use the drugs safely, and at the same time, if they're receptive, find that there are other ways that help can be given to them to come off drugs. So that plus the decriminalisation of some aspects of drugs, I think is really important and a way forward. And we're always having to keep up with and change the ways of working because, as you said, there are different types of drugs coming on the market. And we know, for example, in Dundee that more people are using multiple drugs. It's not just people who take heroin or whatever. It is multiple use of different drugs. And that in itself, obviously, in some cases, must be a lethal concoction. So we've always got to be open as governments and local authorities and third sector organisations working in this field to be open to new ways of working in order to help with people who have this illness.
Thank you, Maureen. And I hope that you and I are able to return to more good news about the expansion of treatment and care for those who need it, and the continuing reduction in the numbers of people dying as a result of drug misuse in Scotland. But we'll move on to our second item this evening, because Network Rail is facing prosecution over a train crash that killed 3 people at Carmont near Stonehaven in Aberdeenshire on the 12th of August 2020. The train driver, Brett McCulloch, 45, the conductor, Donald Denny, who was 58, and a passenger, Christopher Stuchbury, who was 62, all lost their lives in the crash. The case is due to call in the High Court in Aberdeen on the 7th of September. The ScotRail train derailed at 9:37 a.m. after it struck a landslide, hitting gravel and other stony material washed out from a drain. The train hit the side of a bridge, causing its power car and one of the 4 carriages to fall down an embankment. The prosecution comes after the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service considered reports from an investigation by Police Scotland, British Transport Police, and the Office of Rail and Road, the independent safety and economic regulator for the country's railways. The case is listed on the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service court rules as a Section 76 indictment. That's a procedure which suggests a guilty plea may be offered. A Rail Accident Investigation Branch report published last March found that errors in the construction of a drainage system installed by Carillion meant it was unable to cope with heavy rain that fell in the area on the morning of the crash. Carillion, of course, went into compulsory liquidation in January 2018. The RAIB report made 20 recommendations to improve railway safety, many of which were directed at Network Rail. A Network Rail spokesperson said today the Carmont derailment and the tragic loss of Christopher Stuchbury, Donald Dinny and Brett McCulloch was a terrible day for our railway, and our thoughts remain with their families and all those affected by the accident. He went on, while we cannot comment on the ongoing legal process, the Rail Accident Investigation Branch report into Carmont made clear that there were fundamental lessons to be learnt by Network Rail, and we have supported the investigation process. So, Maureen, as I mentioned, the RAIB report from last March found that errors in construction installed by Carillion meant that the drainage system was unable to cope with the rain that fell in that area, leading to the appearance of stone and other debris on the track. Now, I think you and I were talking only last week about the likely need to invest more in better transport infrastructure as our climate changes. So do you think that the report from the RAIB and the prosecution of Network Rail as a result of the crash at Carmont, do you think that might prove to be further evidence of the need to improve our infrastructure as a result of the climate crisis?
Yes, first of all, I'd like to express my sympathies to the families. The August is the month, I think, of the anniversary of this, and it's less than 20 miles away from me, so it is quite local, and it is still quite often talked about in one way or another. So it is important, as you say, that we need to look at how we further improve our infrastructure in the light of what's happening due to our climate change. I mean, one of the classic examples is the A82 and the rock falls over in that part of the country, and how it's really important that any work done on there is climate compatible and for the foreseeable future. So I think in this case, Carillion were an awful company. They were involved in the AWPR, and that's when they went bust. But so much of what they were involved in has turned out to be awful. It's a pity they're not still in business, that perhaps they could have been prosecuted for not doing the job properly. But my understanding is that Network Rail will plead guilty in this case. And I think for the families, that is to be welcomed. But I'm sure that those involved in I'm hoping and surely those involved in Network Rail must be making sure that the inspections of their track and lines, and particularly the embankments that the rails run on, are inspected closely, especially in the light of, as you say, Andrew, the different weather patterns that we have now.
Thanks, Maureen. And as you say, this is the anniversary of the crash in August 2020, and all of our thoughts are with the families of the three people who lost their lives in that accident. We'll move on now, because new research has found that disabled, sick and injured people are being left behind by the UK government. Independent analysis commissioned by the SNP using OECD data shows the UK spends the least of any country in Northwest Europe on financial support for disabled people and workers who become sick or suffer occupational injuries. The UK spends only 1.3% of GDP on incapacity benefits, compared to Norway and Denmark, who spend 3.5 times more at 4.5%. Incapacity benefits include disability benefits, sick pay, and government spending in occupational injury and disease. The UK also falls behind Sweden, Belgium, Finland, Iceland, the Netherlands, and Switzerland, who all spend more than double the amount on incapacity benefit as a proportion of GDP, as well as Luxembourg, Germany, Austria, and France. The research follows 13 years of UK Conservative government cuts and comes amid growing calls from anti-poverty charities for the UK government to increase the support offered to disabled people. Earlier this month, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation warned the UK's social security system is failing to provide adequate support, with disabled people more likely to be in poverty and in very deep poverty. It warned long-standing inequalities mean that households with a disabled person are falling behind faster in the cost of living crisis. The UK government must do more to support households with a disabled person facing disproportionate levels of hardship. Commenting, the SNP's equality spokesperson Kirsten Oswald MP said, "The UK is trailing behind our European neighbours when it comes to the low levels of support Westminster offers to disabled people and workers who get sick or injured. Only with the full powers of independence can Scotland build a fairer system, with strong protectors for disabled people. The social security safety net should be there for us all in our times of need, and it's a scandal so many are left behind under Westminster control." She went on to say the SNP is the only party offering a fairer society with independence and real help with the cost of living. In contrast, Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer must explain why they back cruel cuts and damaging Brexit that are ripping apart the welfare safety net, slashing household incomes, and taking money away from families during a Westminster-made cost of living crisis. She called on the UK government to urgently tackle poverty and increase the support offered to disabled people by introducing an essentials guarantee, by which benefits will always meet the cost of living, raising sick pay, and matching progressive Scottish Government policies like the Scottish Child Payment, which puts money back into people's pockets. Now, Maureen, Kirsten Oswald was asking Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer to explain why they back these policies and the cruel cuts. Now, it struck me that Starmer and Sunak are backing these cruel cuts because that's what their voters keep voting for. I mentioned that we've had 13 years of austerity, and the parlous situation in which disabled people and people in need of support are finding themselves today didn't happen overnight. It took the full 4,856 days since David Cameron first became Prime Minister and launched his campaign of brutal austerity against the weakest and the poorest and those who are most deserving of assistance, and that campaign's just been perpetuated by Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and lastly Rishi Sunak, as people keep voting in England, keep voting for Conservative governments.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, it seems like every time that I come on Broadcasting Scotland, we're talking about different benefits and how they are, you know, some of the worst in Europe. I think we've already talked one week previously about pensions. I think last week we were talking about sickness benefit being part of the lowest in Europe. And today we're talking about disability benefits being a disgrace for the fifth or sixth largest economy in the whole of the world. And, you know, I've said before that austerity is a political and economic choice. And there are different ways of running your economy, as we've seen in other progressive Western European countries. And I was reading another report today, or listening to another report today, that company bosses in the UK are the highest paid after the US. So we are continuing to see the rich get much, much richer beyond any normal person's wildest dreams, and the poor getting hit every single time. And the UK Westminster government continually, you know, bashing the poor and saying that all our problems are because of the poor rather than their policies. And the awful thing is that Stammer has said that he's going to continue these policies. So why anybody doesn't see that there is a different way of doing it, which the SNP offer, and that independence is the only way that we're going to pull this country out of, as I say, the austerity that's chosen by the Westminster parties, and the people of England don't really have a choice, whereas there is that choice in Scotland. And I think the fact that the numbers who want independence is still pretty high, given the problems that the SNP has faced, shows that many people in Scotland do want that choice.
Thanks, Maureen. Now then, let's move on because millions of UK homes did not switch on their heating during cold weather last winter in an attempt to save on their energy bills as the cost of gas and electricity soared. Almost 9 in 10 households tried to cut back on their energy usage last winter, while almost half of all UK households, 13 million homes, said they did not turn on their heating when it got cold. That's according to a survey of 4,000 people by the consumer group Which. The findings revealed that lower income households and those aged between 45 and 64 were more likely to go without winter heating, fueling calls for the government to introduce a discounted social energy tariff for the most vulnerable households. Emily Seymour, the Which energy editor, said it's hugely concerning that an estimated 13 million households have not switched their heating on when it's cold due to fears of high energy bills. About half of households with an annual income of less than £20,000 did not turn on the heating when it was cold, compared with a third of households with an income of more than £80,000, according to the survey. In addition, those aged between 45 and 64 were also found to be more likely than other age groups to go without heating during cold weather, in part because this age group was likely to have more financial responsibilities, but were not yet eligible to access pension savings, Which said. Fresh calls for a social tariff have emerged as Ofgem, the UK energy regulator, prepares to announce the latest price cap on Friday, which will come into effect from October. The cap is expected to dip below an average of £2,000 a year for the typical household, which remains almost double the level before the energy crisis began. Consumer groups have argued that although the cap aims to set a fair rate for household energy bills, it is still unaffordable for low-income households. Instead, they argue that ministers should legislate a social tariff set well below the cost of supplying gas and electricity for households which are in fuel poverty. The UK government has been accused of betraying the most vulnerable in society by failing to introduce a social tariff, despite repeated pledges in the last year to consult on proposals to put one in place by April 2024. So, Maureen, as we've just been saying, the energy price cap is expected to fall below an average of £2,000 a year for the typical household that's paying by direct debit, but that remains almost double the level before the energy crisis began. So, do you think a social tariff for energy, for electricity and gas, is becoming more and more critical as the cost of everything else continues to rise?
Yeah, I think that's the important thing. As everything else continues to rise, um, uh, including energy, people have got used to making savings, sometimes in the wrong area. So, it'd be interesting to see what the figures when they come out are for hypothermic and cold-related deaths. I'm sure they probably have gone up as well. And I think if this government, and I'm not holding my breath, wants to help people and make sure that they are warm as well as fed, that there should be a social tariff. We know that the energy providers are making huge profits, and for these companies to make huge profits while people are fuel poor. And by the way, do you know that there's not a word in Norwegian for fuel poverty? It's not a concept that they recognize. So, again, this is something that the government chooses to impose on people rather than looking after the poorest and most vulnerable in society, rather than seeing that the rich pals are okay.
Thank you, Maureen, and that's some good Norwegian learning. Thank you. I suspect there's one or two other Scandinavian countries where similarly fuel poverty is not a concept that's reflected in the language. But we'll come back to Scottish politics now, because the Scottish Greens have announced that their candidate for the Rutherglen and Hamilton West by-election will be the 20-year-old Cameron Eadie. Mr. Eadie was born in Wishaw and grew up in East Kilbride and then Hamilton before studying an MA in Social and Public Policy at the University of Glasgow. At the launch of his candidacy in Rutherglen Town Hall today, Cameron Eadie warned that Labour and the Tories are failing generations of young people over the climate crisis. He said his campaign will focus on taking action to tackle the climate crisis, securing Scotland's return to the EU as an independent nation, and eradicating child poverty by abolishing cruel Tory and Labour policies such as the two-child benefits cap and the rape clause. Mr. Eadie entered the race for the Westminster seat, saying, "It's my generation and the next being left to deal with the carnage caused by successive Tory and Labour governments and their failures on climate. I'm standing in this election because Green voices have never been so vital. Every single vote for the Scottish Greens will be a vote against the Westminster status quo, a vote for change, and a vote for people and the planet. It's as simple as that," he said. So, Maureen, I had a quick check this afternoon, and as far as I can tell, the Scottish Greens have never stood a candidate for Westminster in this constituency ever before. So, what do you think might have changed?
Well, it's a by-election, and every party wants to keep its profile up, and in a by-election, you're likely to get more airtime than you would in a general election. And the Greens are not that big a party still, although they have quite a deal of influence in a coalition, which, of course, the Scottish Parliament was set up to run on coalitions rather than single parties. And of course, the SNP in 2011 broke that system, which was designed, if you recall, to try and keep the SNP from ever achieving that overall majority. So it will be interesting to see the result in Rutherglen and Hamilton West. Obviously, we haven't heard of all the parties that are going to be standing in a by-election. You usually get loads more than you would in a general election. Normally, they're not more than 4 or 5 in a general election. And it'll be interesting to see whether the crises that we've seen in climate change just in the past few months, every day there seems to be a flood, a terrible flood somewhere, or a hurricane included in wildfires, and just raging across our planet. So it will be interesting to see whether the Greens have a reasonable vote or not. I can't see them winning, but yeah, it will be interesting to see. But we've got a good few weeks to wait before we see that.
Thanks, Maureen. Yes, it's a good point you make. At the East Kilbride West by-election for the council in July, the Green candidate in that election got 3.8% of the first preference votes, whereas the winner, Labour's Kirsty Williams, got more than 40% of the first preference votes. So there's clearly some distance to go. But as you say, it's a by-election, and it's getting a lot of attention. So I'm looking forward perhaps to Count Binface, or his Scottish cousin, who of course notoriously beat both Reform and UKIP candidates several times, whether he will stand or, as I say, his Scottish cousin might join the campaign and get even more attention to the by-election in Rutherglen. I'm sure we'll be covering it more as Parliament returns and the SNP move the writ for the by-election to go ahead. But let's have a look at another story now, because almost half of UK musicians and workers in the music industry have had less work in the EU since Brexit than before it, and more than a quarter have had no EU work at all, according to a survey. The impact of Brexit on the music sector has been devastating. I said the Independent Society of Musicians, which carried out the survey, restrictions have impaired the viability of making a living as a musician, it said. The mezzo-soprano Jennifer Johnson, no relation I think, said Brexit was quietly killing our world-class music sector, and its impact could not be overstated. She said it's time for the government to pull its finger out and reverse some of the damage being done before it is too late. One of those taking part in the ISM survey said work has come to a halt. The offer of European gigs simply dried up. My band simply can't make any kind of living in the tiny UK market, so we basically have folded as a working band. Another said it's been impossible to be heard or audition in European opera houses since the 1st of January 2021. European opera companies are reluctant to audition UK singers since the changes. The ISM took testimony from more than 400 musicians and those working in the sector on their experiences since Brexit until April this year. They were asked to exclude experiences affected by the pandemic during this period. 4 out of 10 of those taking part said they had had work cancelled, and almost as many said they had been forced to turn down work. The most frequently cited extra expenses since Brexit was for visas and work permits. The cost of carnets, customs permits for vehicles, and other travel costs were also mentioned. Carnets dramatically increase the time it takes to cross the border. No one at the border really knows what's going on. The carnet is an unnecessary expense, said one respondent. Another said an extra day of travel is required to go in and out of the EU. That means the vehicle has to leave a day early for an EU tour, adding an extra day of van hire, extra day of backline hire, extra day of wages for all crew, and extra day of wages for the musicians. Even countries that do not require visas or work permits, people in the music sector are limited under the Schengen visa waiver scheme to spending 90 days in any 180-day period in the EU. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA, signed by the UK and the EU on the 30th of December 2020, did not include any specific provisions on short-term travel for creative professionals or support staff. So, Maureen, in the case that the TCA apparently completely ignored this sector, should we really be surprised at the amount of damage we're seeing as a result of the Brexit we've been given?
No, we shouldn't be surprised at all. Remember how the slogan was "Get Brexit Done," and that meant get Brexit done at all costs. And the costs are now coming home to roost. And I think if people had known that this was going to be a result of their voting for Brexit, whether they would, and of course we know increasingly that people now would not have voted for Brexit, given all these things that are coming out. And as you said, Andrew, we tend to think of bands going and playing gigs in Germany and Denmark. But it also includes people who might want to join an orchestra in Europe, or an opera company in Europe. So it's all sorts of musicians and singers, and as you say, backup crews who might want to expand their knowledge by joining crews in the rest of Europe. And think of all the bands that during the summer go and play in places like Ibiza. So all of these performers are being hindered and excluded from gigs on the continent because of Brexit. And you see it on social media how people have failed to get their visas in time, or as you say, are stuck at the border and are having to cancel gigs at the last minute or pull out of festivals. And that would make people on the continent less likely to hire bands from the UK if they cannot be guaranteed to turn up. So yet another horrible result of the Brexit vote.
Thanks, Maureen. Thank you. And if we've time this evening, we may come back to this because there was a question that was in my mind for you. But we've got plenty of stories this evening, so we'll press on for the moment at least. And the next item we have is that the first two defendants in the Georgia election subversion case against Donald Trump and 18 other defendants have been booked into the Fulton County Jail, according to its online database. Scott Hall, an Atlanta area bail bondsman, was booked at the Rice Street Jail today. John Eastman, a Trump attorney and one of the main architects of Trump's plan to halt the certification of Biden's victory, also voluntarily turned himself in later this morning. They are both expected to undergo fingerprinting, submit personal information, and potentially have their mugshots taken. Eastman helped orchestrate the plan for Georgia Republican electors to meet and sign a fraudulent certificate that said that Trump had won the election in what is now known as the fake electors scheme. He also drafted a 6-point memo that directed former Vice President Mike Pence to refuse to certify electoral votes on the 6th of January 2021. Eastman, alongside the Trump attorney and disgraced former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, had spoken at a rally near the US Capitol on the day of the insurrection, where he spread baseless claims of election fraud. Kenneth Chesebro, another Trump attorney who worked closely with Eastman, Trump, and Giuliani to halt the electoral certification and is also named a defendant, was also at the Capitol building that day. Eastman was charged with 9 felony counts, including criminal conspiracy, solicitation, filing false documents, and violating the RICO Act. Hall was charged with 7 felony counts, including 6 criminal conspiracy charges, and also with violating the RICO Act. After Trump's 2020 loss, Hall illegally sought access to voting machines in Coffee County, Georgia, to search for evidence they were rigged. According to the indictment, he travelled to the Coffee County Elections Office to try to copy voter data from the Dominion voting system's machines, which is in breach of privacy and also unlawful. He was charged alongside the Coffee County election officials Misty Hampton and Kathy Latham, as well as the Trump-aligned attorney Sidney Powell, for willfully and unlawfully tampering with electronic ballot markers and tabulating machines, which was an act of conspiracy to commit election fraud. Hall also placed several phone calls to the individuals who were involved with intimidating Georgia poll workers to coerce false testimony about election security, according to the indictment. District Attorney Fannie Willis, who delivered the indictment last week, has given all 19 defendants until noon this Friday, the 25th of August, to voluntarily surrender. Trump, whose bond has been set at £200,000 and who has been charged with 13 felony counts, said he plans to turn himself in on Thursday. So, Maureen, it struck me first of all, turning himself in and being arrested in a county jail in Georgia, not in a federal building, not in Manhattan, in a county jail. Do you think will that maybe bring home to Donald John that he's not in Kansas or Mar-a-Lago anymore, and that come what may, he will not be able to pardon himself from any state crimes he's found guilty of?
Yes, I mean, makes the real difference, doesn't it? That it's at a county level that he's being charged, and as you say, he couldn't pardon himself if, God help us, that he was to become president again. So I think that surely he can see now that the wheels are coming off the Trump bus, and that more and more people who were involved in trying to overturn the election result are being charged with various crimes in relation to that. I mean, somebody like Rudy Giuliani, who I remember seeing it on the television that he was, having rallies in support of Trump and saying that the election was stolen from the Republicans. And apparently Giuliani has not got enough money to hire lawyers to help him with the charges against him, and he's having to sell his New York home. So, yes, the chickens must be coming home for Trump, and surely he's not as delusional as to think that he's somehow going to get away with this, although it would appear that every time he personally is indicted, his poll ratings go up, which show how divided, that's quite a soft word for this, the American population are. And, as we get closer to the parties choosing their candidates for the election, it will be fascinating to see just how this pans out. But my wish would be that these cases are brought to court sooner rather than later to show what a criminal Donald Trump is.
Thanks, Maureen. I'm pretty confident that you and I will be coming back to this and discussing just how hard Trump is working and how much of his donors' money he is spending trying to turn the prosecutions and the next election into another three-ring circus. But we'll come back to Scotland for our final two stories this evening. And firstly, the affordable housing supply in Shetland is set to receive a significant boost as an islands housing association has secured funding from the Scottish Government's Housing Infrastructure Fund. Hjaltland Housing Association will receive £20 million, which will enable the social landlord to start the project at Steny Hill in Lerwick later this year. The Butte House Agreement includes a commitment to deliver 110,000 affordable homes by 2032, of which at least 70% will be available for social rent and 10% will be in our remote, rural and island communities. The funding was announced by Housing Minister Paul McLennan during a series of visits to the Highlands and the Islands. Mr McLennan said, "This is a significant investment in affordable housing supply in Lerwick. It will make a huge contribution to the housing challenges being felt by Shetland, with particular pressures on Shetland itself. Recognising the challenges and barriers facing our rural communities, we will continue to support these areas and face those challenges head on. High quality, highly energy efficient and affordable housing is a key pillar for tackling these issues, and this project will be a big step forward in working towards removing those barriers locally. Our rural and island communities play an essential role in our economy, and we will continue to support the delivery of more affordable housing to keep people in these areas and attract others to live there." So, Maureen, so far as I can remember, the population of Lerwick is about 7,000 and the population of the Shetland Isles is about 23,000. So 300 new homes is going to make a significant impact, isn't it?
Absolutely, and sorely needed, because there is still quite a bit of oil and gas related activity in Shetland, and there's still pressure on local housing. So it's important that 70% of it is going to be social housing, and hopefully for local people so that they can stay on the island. But I was thinking while you were talking, was it not Shetland where the Labour Lib Dem coalition only built 4 social housing during their tenure of office, and yet we're seeing the SNP government consistently building thousands of houses for social rent throughout Scotland. And the fact that Paul McLennan went up there to make this announcement, I think, shows the commitment of the Scottish Government to all areas of Scotland in terms of housing, because we know in the Highlands and Islands there is acute pressure from second homes on the ability for local people to stay locally because they cannot afford housing. So this is a really important announcement today, and going towards the target, meeting the target of hundreds of thousands of houses being built.
Thanks, Maureen. And it struck me as well, thinking about the nature of the challenges of building social housing in remote or rural or island communities. This contribution by this is just a contribution by the Scottish Government to the Hjaltland project at Stanywick. It's £20 million to build 300 houses. So that contribution is nearly £70,000 a house, and that's just a contribution to the cost. So do you think, does that help to give a clearer indication of some of the challenges of building affordable or social housing in our rural and island communities? I'm thinking about the added cost of transporting, the added cost of materials, the added cost of transporting materials, the need for properties to be particularly energy efficient, and also the added cost of labour. There's a shortage of builders in the Central Belt, let alone in our rural and remote and island communities.
Yeah, I don't think people quite understand the huge problems that there are in constructing houses in our remote, rural and island communities. You pointed out the costs of getting labour and materials to the islands to build these houses. even although, you would always try to use local labour companies to build these. But it is a big problem, not only in projects like housing, but all sorts of projects on the islands. And we've already seen that many projects have been stopped or delayed because of the increased costs due to Brexit and the crashing of the economy by Liz Truss. So costs are rising exponentially. And then you've got the added costs of building, as we say, on Shetland and other islands. So, it's not surprising that the cost is 70,000 plus to build a house. I think it will be much higher in the end, but all that has got to be taken into account when the Scottish Government is talking about investment in housing. It wouldn't be a surprise if there are fewer houses built because of the huge increase of costs, much of it due to the Westminster Government.
Thanks, Maureen. That's absolutely right. The £70,000 per house figure I had is a contribution to get the project started from the Scottish Government, and the Housing Association will be raising the balance in order to then complete the housing. But thank you. And let's go to our final item now this evening, because the use of snare traps could be banned as part of new plans to protect vulnerable wildlife and promote sustainable wildlife management. The Scottish Government is seeking the public's views on whether an outright ban should be put in place or if any exemptions should be considered. A snare is a thin wire noose used for catching a wild animal for the purposes of wildlife management. The consultation is also asking for opinions on extending the investigative powers of the Scottish SPCA, a new measure which could help tackle wildlife crime. This will involve giving SSPCA inspectors more authority to search, examine, and seize evidence related to incidents of illegal hunting and other offences related to wildlife persecution. The Environment Minister, Gillian Martin, said snare traps lead to unnecessary suffering for animals, and these proposals are part of our ongoing efforts to ensure that wildlife management is both sustainable and humane. Currently, only a small number of farmers and land managers use snare traps. More effective and humane forms of managing wildlife are available, and we will continue to support the industry to make use of those methods. Wildlife crime and the illegal killing of wild mammals continues to blight our rural communities. By extending the investigative powers of SSPCA inspectors, we can ensure that the destructive impact that these criminals have on our environment is diminished and that they are brought to justice. The Scottish Government's consultation will run for 6 weeks from today until the 3rd of October 2023. So, Maureen, do you think that, in fact, that there will be much, if any, support for retaining the right to use snare traps, bearing in mind that snare traps are only legal in, I think, 6 countries in Europe?
Undoubtedly, there will be some recalcitrant landowners and their gamekeepers who still think that they should have a God-given right to trap, which is one of the most inhumane ways of killing species. And we know that species diversity is declining all the time, and there are other humane methods of trapping animals if that is required. So I think there should absolutely be a ban on these inhumane trapping methods, and that licenses should be required if trapping is proven to be absolutely necessary. Trapping is always controversial. I can remember any time it was brought up in the Scottish Parliament, there were a huge amount of lobbying on both sides of the argument. But I'm sure it won't be any different this time. So anyone who's got an interest in this, I do hope that they will reply to the consultation.
Thanks, Maureen. And yes, as one of our other contributors often says, it's important to respond to these consultation documents. If people don't respond and don't make their voices heard, then the consultation can't consider their perspective. So we should all contribute where we possibly can to these Scottish Government consultation documents. But I'm afraid that's all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland depends on the generosity of the viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station, and to make new programmes for you. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Right now, we have a pressing need to raise £30,000 to pay our bills and to ensure that we are able to continue making programmes. Thanks to the generosity of our supporters, we have now raised over £13,500, but we still really need to raise the remaining £16,500 by the end of this week, if possible. To everyone who has donated, and to everyone who has already signed up to make a regular monthly payment to Broadcasting Scotland as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you'd like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Broadcast Scot, and please like and retweet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. We will be back at 7 p.m. sharp tomorrow evening for the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please come and join us then. And I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's been watching this evening, and of course, to say a very special thanks to our very special guest, Maureen Watt. Thanks, Maureen.
You're welcome, Andrew. Hope to see you again soon.
It's always a pleasure, Maureen. Thank you for joining us this evening. On this day in 1513, the Scottish army under James IV, numbering some 42,000 men, crossed the River Tweed near Coldstream. The campaign would of course end with the Battle of Flodden, with James IV killed in the fighting, becoming the last monarch from Great Britain to die in battle. That, and the loss of a large proportion of the Scottish nobility, led to a political crisis in Scotland. Some historians also sometimes use the Battle of Flodden to mark the end of the Middle Ages on the British Isles. The flowers of the forest are a weed away. Please look after yourselves. Please have a very peaceful evening. Bye-bye.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.